Magandang hapon mula sa Pilipinas. My name is Jean Encinas-Franco. Welcome to the Philippine webinar series brought to you by the University of Sydney Southeast Asia Center. Together with the assistance from Simon Holding, we will be presenting to you Dr. Pamela Cajilig's study on citizenship regimes in post-disaster communities in the Philippines. Let me introduce her first. Dr. Pamela Gloria Cajilig is a design anthropologist with 25 years of experience at the junctures of research, consulting, and advocating for community-centered and gender-responsive interventions in disaster management and climate adaptation. She recently joined the University of the Philippines College of Architecture as a professorial lecturer and is co-founder of Curiosity, a design research consultancy that has, since its establishment in 2012, completed over 300 research, training, and workshop projects in human-centered design for the civic, public, and public sectors. She is a global fellow doing research on NGO decision-making during complex disasters at the Brown University Center for Human Rights and Humanitarian Studies, as well as a consultant working on determining the effectiveness of locally led disaster management for the Melbourne-based Humanitarian Advisory Group. Pamela finished her PhD in Architecture and Design at the Royal Melbourne Institute of Technology University, where her research on disaster recovery in Manila Bay explored fisherfolk's design and citizenship practices. Her efforts in participatory disaster management were recognized by the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction Asia Pacific Women's International Leadership Awards. Dr. Cajilig, you have the virtual floor.
Thanks so much for that introduction, and thanks so much, Simon, and all the universities that have collaborated for this webinar to happen. So this is my webinar for today, Building Relations, Negotiating Regimes of Citizenship in Post-Disaster Housing Reconstruction through Kinship. I'm here as a professorial lecturer of the University of the Philippines College of Architecture, but this research was conducted as part of my PhD at the RMIT University School of Architecture and Urban Design. And in fact, I can see my PhD supervisor, Professor John Fine, in the audience. So thanks so much, John, for attending. And that's I'm going to start first by introducing my case site. This is the landscape leading to my research site. So it's basically at the mouth of the Angat Pampanga River, where the river meets Manila Bay. And as you can see, it's filled with fish ponds. This area was filled with mangrove forests in the early 20th century, around 55,000 acres of hectares of mangrove forests, and these were gradually cut down due to development and commercial activities, most especially a loan program in the 1980s that encouraged the development of fish ponds in the area. And so the cut down mangrove forests have reduced rather the disaster resilience in the area, with mangroves used to be providing protection from storm surges in Manila Bay and flooding by the river. So this is about 2 hours from where I live in Quezon City. I travel 2 hours by land, and then boat to the island takes about 30 minutes to an hour, depending on the weather conditions. This is my actual field site, where I did nearly 3 years of hybrid ethnographic research. So as you can see, it's a very built-up island with houses built at the island's edge. When this island is flooded, and it's flooded daily, it's difficult to distinguish land from water. There are about 3,000 residents living in this island, and they've been affected by so many typhoons and monsoon season. So flooding is a regular part of their lives. But of course, during typhoons, they experience storm surges, and that tends to wash away their homes. Here in the photo was a neighborhood that used to have houses on stilts, around 25 of them, that were completely washed away during Typhoon Glenda in 2014. And that's what the residents say has been the strongest storm to strike the island. So I'm just going to show you a close-up of that area. So this is where it is. Out of those 25 houses that were standing on stilts in 2014, there's only one remaining, and you can see the remains of the houses that were washed away. This is what the island looks like on a flooded day. And as you can see, the residents still go about their daily activities. So flooding is really part of their lives, but that doesn't mean that it hasn't caused tremendous damage in the island. This is just a list of the hazards that the island experiences. So we have Typhoon Ondoy in 2009, but of course there were other typhoons that were not as strong that came before that, and Typhoon Glenda in 2014. And in 2020, for the Filipinos in the room, you'll recall that there were several typhoons, around 6 typhoons in 5 weeks that vast parts of Luzon needed to overcome. The area also experiences land subsidence. So this is the compacting of the land because of development activity, specifically groundwater extraction, which causes the land to sink. So as the land is sinking, the island is also experiencing sea level rise at 3.2 millimeters per year in Manila Bay, and this is 3 times the global average. And of course, on top of all of that, the residents experienced the livelihood effects, especially of the COVID-19 pandemic, especially during the lockdown. So in this island, it's hard to say that there are non-disaster times. People are always in crisis, and that's something that our disaster policy makers really need to pay attention to. So I will talk about the regimes of citizenship that are experienced on the island. These are basically formal and informal structures of power that influence how belonging and membership in a particular polity is defined, as well as the entitlements and accountabilities that go with it. So for example, the vaccine regime that we were all experienced to as an example of regime of citizenship. During our individual governments basically identified who was more deserving of the vaccines, who needed to receive them first versus others. So this is one example of a disaster regime of citizenship. And I'll be talking about 4 regimes of citizenship in post-disaster housing reconstruction. Now, what I'm going to talk about today are my findings that have been written up as a book chapter. And in that chapter, I only focused on 3 regimes of citizenship: the localism regime, response regime, and palakasan system. But as I was developing the presentation, I realized that there's a 4th regime, a geomorphological regime that is related to the island context of the residents. And the basic point of that chapter is that fisher folk mobilize their kinship networks. They either reinvigorate past kinship relations or generate new kinship relations in order to negotiate these different regimes of citizenship during disaster. So as opposed to studies of kinship from a classical anthropology perspective, I treat kinship here as a dynamic and political act rather than simply as a given feature of a particular society. So let me go first to the regime of localism. So the regime of localism has several influences. One of these influences is the realization of governments around the world that widespread crises like climate change and biodiversity need to be addressed by reconciling conflicting policies and also by getting multiple sectors to work together. In the Philippines in particular, localism was influenced by the transition between the Marcos Sr. administration to the first Aquino administration, where the 1991 local government code devolved a lot of the national level services to the local governments. In the Philippines, we have, of course, the Disaster Risk Reduction and Management Law and the Climate Change Adaptation Act, which emphasize local participation in disaster and climate action, as well as stipulates disaster financing mechanisms at the local level. And these in turn are influenced by international policy frameworks such as the Hyogo Framework and later the Sendai Framework, Paris Agreement, as well as the Grand Bargain of the 2016 Humanitarian Summit, which is basically a gathering of the biggest donor governments and international NGOs around the world, where they all agreed that there needs to be a participation revolution, and those affected by crises need to take the lead in terms of deciding how assistance is going to be managed. Now, the regime of localism in disaster is reflected in the island by the minimal resources that the town and the island village has for disaster management. So by law, 5% of the municipal revenue or city revenue needs to go to disaster risk reduction. So for that particular town that the island belongs to, that's 17 million pesos or just 301,000 US dollars for a population of 133,000. For the island, that 5% is 138,000 pesos or just US $2,500 for a population of more than 3,000. So that's barely a can of sardines for every resident on the island. And there is a lot of frustration, particularly from the village officers or the barangay officers, when it comes to looking for resources for disaster management and particularly for disaster relief and recovery. They said that they are constantly asked to attend training, constantly asked to make plans, but the budget to implement them just isn't there. What they are really looking for is livelihood support, but they are mostly only given food relief. And this reflects findings by Brocal 2020 that disaster financing in the Philippines mostly goes to relief. About 60% of local government disaster financing in the Philippines goes to relief, which leaves so little room for longer-term disaster measures such as sustainable recovery, mitigation, and preparedness. Now, in relation to that, as a result of local governments being responsible for the full scale of disaster management, regardless of what their income level is, this now then leads to the response regime and disaster risk reduction management, where, as I mentioned earlier, majority of the resources really goes to response, and very few of the resources are given to recovery and reconstruction and even preparedness. So out of the 5%, remember that 138,000 pesos for the island or $2,500, 30% of that goes to quick response and recovery. So you have very little left really. It's almost negligible for things like reconstruction. So for reconstruction, preparedness and recovery, there is a lot of reliance on external actors, including the national government and also philanthropists and individual politicians and powerful individuals. The third regime is the palakasan system. So palakasan is basically a competition for power that goes beyond the rule of law, that encourages people to make as many personal contacts as they can in order to tap into this power. And palakasan, from a leadership perspective, is seen as leaders empathizing with their constituents to the point that they're willing to go beyond the law to demonstrate their pagdamay or their empathy to their constituents. And many of the fisher folk on the island have complained that if you don't participate in this system, if you don't get on the good side of officials, then you basically won't qualify for disaster assistance. So palakasan is seen as one of the root causes of uneven distribution of disaster assistance in the island. The fourth regime would be the geomorphological regime, and this is basically people being marginalized for disaster management because of their island context. In my conversation with a municipal and planning development officer, I asked them if they have any plans to arrest the flooding in the island due to land subsidence. And they said that there are plans to reduce land subsidence and therefore decrease flooding by looking for additional sustainable water sources. But when I asked them if that plan included island populations, they said no. This is mostly focused on inland. And I see this as a legacy of colonial urban planning. And before colonization, set the center of many societies. It wasn't the Philippines yet then. The center of many societies were the coasts and the islands. Coasts and islands, were the center of political life, cultural life, and this moved inland when the Spanish introduced the Pueblo planning system, where you have the plaza and the town hall and the church facing each other across the plaza. And this is when life turned inland and where life on the coasts and the islands became neglected. So why am I thinking of framing responses to this regime through kinship? Well, first of all, this is really based on my experiences of walking around the island with women residents who were affected by the disaster. So when I first asked for a tour of the island, I asked my companions to point out sites in the island that they felt were key to understanding disaster. And many of them would point out concrete houses, 2 or 3-story houses, or they would point out dilapidated houses. And what was key to all these conversations are the relationships that either allow these houses to be rebuilt and repaired after disaster, or which enable the houses to fall into a state of disrepair. So they would, point to a concrete house and say, oh, this house, they were able to build a second floor because there is an overseas Filipino worker in the family and they're sending remittances. Or this house fell into disrepair because the siblings who co-owned it fought with each other and they both left the island. So that was my cue that kinship is an important part of the island. And for me, I saw this as an opportunity to shed light on the lived experiences of disaster and concepts related to the disaster that you don't really see in policy documents. It's rare to see the word kinship in a disaster policy document, and yet the concept is very important to the people living in the island. And secondly, kinship is central to theories of coastal settlement in the archipelago that we now call the Philippines. So the island was populated basically by kinship groups traveling from different parts of the Southeast Asian region to inhabit the Philippines, and they were grouped according to kinship groups. My view of kinship in the chapter also challenges Eurocentric interpretations of kinship, studies of kinship that were mostly inspired by medieval histories that focused on blood relations, patrilineage, or lineage according to male members of the family, and neatly bounded groups. When I think of Eurocentric interpretations of kinship, I think of Game of Thrones, because the TV show is composed of very clear family groups battling for power. But in the second wave of kinship studies, particularly in anthropology, there was a conscious attempt to decenter European perspectives of kinship by not necessarily focusing on blood relations and by placing importance in both paternal and maternal sides of the family in some Filipino studies of kinship. And in the second wave of kinship, kinship is not necessarily seen as blood relations, but the culture of relatedness. So this would mean that, looking at kinship in the island, I just don't look at families who are related by blood, but also the role of neighbors, childhood friends, and also ritual kin that are formed through like baptism and weddings, such as godparents. So as I mentioned earlier, I see kinship as a political response to the regimes of citizenship that I mentioned. So when I say kinship is a form of cultural citizenship, it means that kinship has basically been a practice that was drawn from, and this part of the beliefs and values and practices that arise out of negotiating formal and informal relationships with the state. So I see kinship again as a political act, and I thought that cultural citizenship would be a more analytically reflexive term to other alternatives such as social capital and social networks. My goal is to politicize kinship and look at it as a dynamic citizenship response to the inequalities that happen during disaster and particularly post-disaster housing reconstruction. So I'll go to two cases that show the importance of kinship relations and not necessarily blood relations to disaster response. So the first case is Daniel and Jenny. Daniel is a fisher and his wife Jenny is a fish vendor. So they used to have a house that was washed away during Typhoon Glenda. They used to have a house on stilts, a big house, airy house where they used to entertain a lot of friends and neighbors in their free time. This is now their new house that was built on a spare piece of land owned by Daniel's parents. But when I say owned, this doesn't necessarily mean that there's a land title. It's just that their family has been living there for generations. So as you can see, the house is built of found materials. They were excluded for some reason by the disaster assistance that was given after Typhoon Glenda. So while others whose houses were completely washed away received 10,000 pesos or roughly US $200, they didn't receive anything. So they were forced to look for found materials and rebuild their house. They rebuilt their house with the help of Daniel's childhood friends who have some knowledge of carpentry. And they also received 3,000 pesos from one of their wedding godfathers, who at the time of the interview was the vice mayor of the town. So I asked Daniel's parents because they were the ones who selected these godparents during the wedding. I asked them, what's their criteria for selecting godparents, and they said, well, the personality has to be like the helpful kind of personality, and they also have to be like in a position to give help when needed. So these three godfathers during the wedding at the time of their interview were the former vice mayor, the former police chief, and the former village captain. And the couple would, because they were always excluded from receiving livelihood and reconstruction assistance, they would go to these godfathers for help to rebuild their homes after disaster. Now, it's not easy to ask help from godparents based on this quote. So Jenny said that when they asked help from their godfather, the vice mayor, it really took a lot of courage on their end because they were very embarrassed to ask for help given their social position, and they have been asking for help repeatedly. But she said they really needed help, so she didn't feel any shame. What she did was she wrote a long letter to their godfather explaining their circumstances, and they know that he owned a fast food joint in the town. So she sat there for a weekend just hoping that he would drop by, and he finally did. So she gave him the letter, and he gave her 3,000 pesos on the spot, or roughly $80. And she said that they tried to repay the favor by campaigning for this godfather during elections. And they also try to be understanding on their end because sometimes they ask for help at a time when he has just lost elections. So they try not to ask for too much when that happens. But in general, they bring him fish, shrimp, and seafood catch for his family to enjoy. And their entire family campaigns for him whenever he runs for office during elections. The second case is Linda, who is an orphan and migrant and a widow in her 60s. So she doesn't have a lot of connections in the community by blood, and she certainly doesn't have any powerful politically connections. But what Linda has is a degree in social work, which she finished at 55 years old. And because of this degree, she is frequently tapped to conduct census and needs assessments to draw up beneficiary lists after disasters. So she establishes reciprocal relations through these needs assessment and research-based activities. And she's also seen as community leader. She's a senior citizen leader in the community, which gives her a small allowance for some daily needs. Now, this is her house, or the remnants of her house that was washed away by Typhoon Glenda. And you'll see that there's a piece of land here that did not come with a site. This piece of land is filling material. So you have to purchase this and fill the land so that you can rebuild the house higher in preparation for higher flooding. So this soil here or filling material costs about 9,000 pesos or a little less than $200, but she was able to get this for half the price because what she does is she negotiates with the workers who can be paid to find and haul this filling material. So what she does is she puts their children, for example, or their relatives on beneficiary lists, even though they're not officially part of the island. They live in another island. And because of that, she gets discounts in filling materials. So this is a quote from her. They, the mananambak or the workers who haul filling materials say, pick me, pick me. Always they say, pick me, interview me, like for needs assessment. I move fast. I'm able to help because I can get a lot of things. So she doesn't see, she doesn't think that she expects anything from the workers when she helps them. She says she does this out of pure empathy. And if they give her something back, well, that's just a bonus, but she's there to care. So, this is one necessarily connected by with people connected by blood, but for this, in this case, it's people who live in another island, workers who haul filling material who can potentially help her in the future. So I'll just quickly summarize what we went through. So in general, the resources for post-disaster housing reconstruction and disaster risk reduction and management in general are quite scarce. And given the burdens placed on local governments and local communities to address the full scale of disaster risk reduction and management with these scarce resources, people are really forced to prioritize. So the localism regime forces people to prioritize disaster response and short-term perspectives when it comes to disaster management. And because of these limited resources, the disaster affected are also forced to participate in a palakasan system by mobilizing and recreating their kinship networks. And as a result, the participation in these kinship networks to ask for disaster assistance tends to drive people towards paternalistic and exclusionary relationships. So in short, kinship is both a resource and a challenge for residences who are trying to overcome disaster. It's a resource because at the very least, they're able to get short-term disaster response, but it can also be a challenge because it's not easy to ask for help. There are strings attached when asking for help. And it's not long-term help. And it's also always at the mercy of, the more powerful, the more connected people in the community. And just a few recommendations. Some policy frameworks really need to be sensitive to how complex disasters are. Existing dominant policy frameworks assume that disasters are exceptional events, But based on this case, people are dealing with different disasters simultaneously, and their interconnectedness compounds like their marginality, and which makes them politically vulnerable as well as vulnerable to various hazards. Secondly, is we really need to consult with community members to obtain a larger context of vulnerability and resilience. One of the frequent complaints of community leaders who are in charge of distributing disaster assistance in the community is that disaster beneficiary lists are not updated as frequently as they should and are unable to capture the rate of social mobility within a particular community. So that in the list, someone may be qualified to receive assistance, but it's possible that this person invested in a business a few years back, and that business already grew and they're already middle class. Or on the other hand, somebody who does not qualify to become a beneficiary has suddenly lost all their relatives and has no form of support. So in this regard, I find it really helpful to work with barangay or village health workers because part of their job is to go house to house um, and to understand the health conditions of each family. So they really have a grasp of who's more vulnerable than others in the community. And I would also recommend an intersectional rather than an individualized approach to beneficiary lists. It's quite common for beneficiary lists to just be based on, you know, the number of, say, for example, pregnant women in the community. But the moral world of disaster affected communities tends to be more complex. So, for example, a pregnant woman with relatives who are working abroad and sending remittances is not necessarily seen as vulnerable compared to a woman who is not pregnant but has zero form of social support. And lastly, there is so much research to be done with regards to kinship and relatedness in the context of the distribution of disaster assistance. I've just scratched the surface, but there's certainly room to do longitudinal studies and mixed method studies and really understand the long-term implications of relying on kinship to overcome disaster. So this is really a rich area to explore, and I'll end there. And on a final note, if for anyone who is interested in accessing the chapter or a link to the book on which the chapter is part of, there are so many interesting case studies in this book, as well as a link to view or download the PhD thesis which inspired the chapter. There's a QR code here. And you can also email me at my University of the Philippines email address, and I'm happy to get in touch and um, answer some questions.
Many thanks, Dr. Cajilig, for your fascinating work. Indeed, understanding the social and governance implications of disasters is very important in the context of the Philippines, which is indeed a country that's disaster prone. Um, I'm pretty sure our audience are raring to ask questions and provide comments. So please, if you wish to ask questions, you may write on the chat box, or you may raise your virtual hand. Please note that we are recording the webinar, and if you have friends who are unable to make it, we will definitely uh, be able to provide them via the SSEAC social media pages. Okay. Maybe in case the participants are still thinking of questions, may I ask the first question, Dr. Cajilig. You walked us through the governance implications of your findings, and you actually said that the budget in post-disaster operations go to relief, much of the
Yeah.
budget
Mhm.
compared to longer term implementation of projects to probably rebuild communities or prevent another disaster. This is actually fairly common, a common what do you call this occurrence, even in other areas of governance. So I would ask if while you were doing your research, have you found any reason as to why this is the case?
Mm, I think that, well, there's just really the scarcity. That's one. But I think also, um, long-term disaster response, is not sexy from a political point of view. So uh, elected officials in particular would rather implement something that they can finish within their term. If it's something that's long-term but cannot be realized within the time that they're in office, then they're not likely to support it. So what they tend to favor is, for example, purchase of ambulances, because then as a politician you can take that photo with the ambulances at the back. It shows that you care for the people. It's something that can be disseminated in the media. It makes for good press release. So that's one that is one influence of why it's so focused. And I would say that um to counter this is why NGOs and the presence of the civic sector is really important, because it's the civic sector that can really help ensure this continuity of plans and help advocate with those affected by disaster, even as disaster plans might be vulnerable to changes in office.
Yes, thank you. Indeed, that's the case. Any questions, comments from our panel? Anyone else? Yeah. Um, Maybe I need to ask a little. Some people maybe,
Mm,
we have a question already. Um, may I read it? This is from Adrian Carlo Manlangit. Good day, Dr. Pamela. I'm curious about post-disaster collective action and how it
mm.
sits beside kinship-based patronage. Would you say that the activation of these kinship-based patronage networks preempted the potential of collective action?
Um, yeah, I would say that they have something to do with collective action, because I mean it's so hard to separate the personal with the political, right? If I look back on my own experiences of, say, in collective action, participating in rallies or programs that have sought to hold the government accountable, a big part of it is because, oh, my friends are joining as well, or I have mentors who encouraged me to join. So I think that kinship is really an underappreciated term,
Yeah. Mm.
and concept in terms of mobilizing political action, because it's not it's really not just us as individuals um, liaising with our relating to our community or the state without any barriers. No, we do that through our own social networks, whether they're family or friends. If you look at say the political rallies of the 2022 elections, people were there with their kinship groups. So this is a mediator of political and collective action, not simply an apolitical feature of society.
Indeed. Thank you, Dr. Cajilig. Yeah, earlier I was about to ask regarding the localization of our disaster laws, just for our international audience. In the Philippines, of course, we have national laws, but because there are functions that are devolved to
Mhm.
local government units, then some of these laws need to be localized. How
Mhm.
important is this in dealing with post-disaster governance? The
Right.
localization of these laws.
Well, they're very important. I would say that, in relation to the grand bargain, the people who are most affected by crisis, should have the power to decide. But we also need to be careful that localization is truly empowering rather than oppressive, right? So there are many instances in which localization becomes a burden. Local participation becomes a burden to those affected by disaster, women in particular, because they're seen as the ones who are doing nothing at home. They're the ones who are, and I know you're interested in this, you're a gender, you're a gender scholar as well, right? So they're the ones who are seen doing nothing while their husbands work. So they're the ones who are seen as having the time to attend all these local participation and consultation sessions, but there's no provision given to them in terms of childcare. So they're just expected to leave infants and young children at home. A lot of these sessions are also not planned around their care responsibilities at home. So if you're going to invite women to a local participation session, for example, also think, well, who's going to cook? Um, um, and also that's also seen as free labor as well, right? Because it takes time. Participating in local disaster management activities also has an opportunity cost, and I don't think that a lot of participatory and localized disaster programs have really good intentions in terms of empowering the disaster affected, but it can also be a burden, and that's where we have to be. We have to be careful. And on a broader scale, like on a broader scale of local governments, yes, it's important to localize. It's important for people to have control over the decisions, but we also need to acknowledge that resources at the local level are not enough. So to be honest, I don't know how feasible it is to dictate that every single local government, regardless of their level, allocate only 5% of their budget for disaster risk reduction and management. Because if you're a fishing community, then the base of that 5% is very, very low. And marginalized communities who are like part of sixth class municipalities with the lowest income bracket are the ones who are most affected by disaster. So it's a paradox that those who are most affected by disaster by law would have the least resources to spend for disaster risk reduction and management.
Yeah, I think localization and budgeting are very important, no? And yeah, it's but budget is perennially scarce, but it has to be used wisely. Yeah, and especially in
Yes,
such large operation such as post-disaster management. Yeah,
yes.
there's
And that's
another.
not the only, sorry, sir, go ahead, go
Yeah,
ahead.
please, please. Yeah,
Okay. And that's not the only problem. I think it's also the procedural way in which the scale of disaster response is determined.
yeah, exactly.
So if there are I think two or more barangays affected, then that merits disaster response at the municipal or city level. And then if two or more towns are affected, then provincial level. But if you're an island and you're the only one experiencing disaster, as is in the case study, and everyone else living inland is more or less safer,
Yeah,
then there's no mechanism to mobilize local government resources at a higher level because you're just an island, right?
yeah,
And that's something that we really need to think about, considering that we're an archipelago. We have so many island communities, right? That are not part of mega cities.
yeah, yeah. That's the case. We have another question from Constanza Barbilieni Amide. Dear Dr. Cajilig, I was wondering what are residents' perceptions of longer-term climate resilience and disaster management in Isla Salsa, and more generally from your experience. Thank you for your time.
Right. So that is a very good question, also a very complex question. So in climate adaptation, for example, There are three pathways. So the first is defense, where you build coastal defenses like seawalls, right? The other is accommodation. So this is what we least know about. It's just living with whatever the flooding or whatever climate hazard there is. It's what we least know about in the literature, but that is what most people who are threatened by climate change and climate disasters are doing, just living with it and doing what they can, rebuilding their houses higher, and similar household level practices. And then there's retreat, which is basically resettlement. Um, so there have been some attempts in the Philippines to do like large scale resettlement, like resettle entire islands. But that's also been met by resistance from those affected, particularly fisher folk. And I think one challenge here is that for fisher folk, fishing is not just a job, it's part of their identity. When you talk to fisher folk, even like the way they talk, the proverbs or words of wisdom that they say, it's all tied to the ocean. And I remember talking to a particular fisher folk who was so upset that they would need to be resettled inland after Typhoon Yolanda, because they said, well, we're fisher folk, we're fish, we're like fish. You take us
Mm,
out of the water and our life loses meaning. And I think
mm,
this is something that um, disaster managers and policymakers need to take into consideration. The livelihoods are not replaceable; they're part of
mm,
identities. So, if there needs to be resettlement inland, well, first that has to be participatory, and second is you need to deal with the loss of identity. It could, because it's not a simple change of jobs. For the particular case that I'm talking about, because they were fisher folk, they were resettled inland, and so they were made to do uh, canning tuna, like livelihood based on canning tuna, which is very different from fishing. For this community in particular, Isla Sasa, they're really tired of the frequency of flooding and the fact that they have to rebuild their houses every 10 to 15 years on so meager resources. So they are looking forward to moving inland, but there are no plans. There used to be plans way back in 2014, but the flooding has been so extreme that even at the provincial level, they couldn't find any land to relocate them to, because the most part of the province is are flooded.
yeah, yeah. Thank you, Dr. Cajilig, for specifying that. Any more questions? Yeah. I was just while waiting for another question, I'm just curious, Dr. Cahilig, with regard to doing research in the communities.
Mm.
Are you said that, only, I mean, earlier you said that people are tired, and that's, you can only sense that if you really do ethnographic work, going to communities, talking to people. But how did they receive you? I
Mm.
mean, as someone who's uh, obviously from quote unquote another world, what was the how was the how were the people? I mean, how did they react to your presence in the film?
Well, it helped that I was part of a research group that
Mm,
already had a relationship with the island. I was part of a UST-based research group that had a community outreach program in the island. So that definitely helped. But of course, as an ethnographic researcher, I'm very conscious of my position in the community. And I'm very conscious of not just going there to extract data.
mm,
That's the last thing that I want to do.
mm,
So I also make sure that I I I genuinely show I show my genuine care for the community. I've organized several humanitarian trips just asking resources from my immediate social network, and trying to address, medical needs, calls for medicine, etc. I also try to help them, for example, write letters requesting for scholarships.
Mhm.
So it doesn't necessarily have to be related to disaster, but like there have been some people in the community, some promising scholars, they know I'm connected to UP, and want to continue their education. So I help point them to the right resources. I help them write letters like scholarship requests. I've mobilized my own personal network to help the community. So for example, there were a few students in the community that were going to take their LET, like their teacher's exam. And I know someone who created the reviewer for the teacher's exam. So I sent some reviewers. I think that as researchers, we don't need to box ourselves in the topic
Yeah,
that we're working on. We can help in other ways. Be like if we have skill sets that will help the community in general, not just related to our particular research topic, then we should absolutely do that because it's two-way, right? We have to recognize that in doing this research, we also, quite frankly, we further our own research. It has
yeah,
contributions to our career. So we should not be looking at this as one way and that we're the experts simply because we're from the academe or are
yeah,
more educated.
exactly. And that you become an advocate, no? As well, not just a researcher. Yeah. Okay, if yeah, there are no more questions, perhaps I'd like to ask Dr. Cajilig to say a few last words and a message to our audience.
Yeah, I mean, the main result of the main impact of this study for me is I became um, an even stronger advocate of participatory and localized approaches. But also, I would also like to caution us again, as I said earlier, that in advocating for these participatory approaches, sure that we're not being extractive, because one critique of participatory approaches is it's just one way for researchers and consultants to earn money without really facilitating gains for the community. So we have to be reflective in our own practice. And if we see that participatory practices can lead to greater marginality, greater inequality, then we also have to be at the forefront of stopping that.
Yeah. Thank you, Dr. Cajilig. It's a fascinating and amazing research, and I'm pretty sure our participants have learned a lot from your talk and from our conversation today. So many thanks once again. Thank you for those who joined us. Please tell your friends that we have a recording of this. Just watch out when the University of Sydney Southeast Asia Center social media page uploads it. So on behalf of Simon Holding, I'm Jean Encinas-Franco from the Philippines, and from the University of Sydney Southeast Asia Center. We would like to thank everyone and thanks for joining us.